Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It's my great pleasure to have you all joining us today for a presentation by Carlo Cottarelli, the director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department. Carlo and I share a love of movies, but Carlo is much wittier and better about integrating that with his economics than I am. So we will be talking today about From Here to Eternity, the outlook for fiscal adjustment in the advanced economies. As you're all aware, Carlo has had a number of years of distinguished service at the IMF, previously working in the Italian government, but in particular over the last few years has, under great political and time pressure, led the fiscal department both independently and jointly with the research department in doing an awful lot of important work and research in real time that has affected the policy debate, and I think in very constructive and sound ways. We also have seen the Fiscal Monitor grow into being not just de jure but de facto one of the fund's three major publications, along with the obviously the WEO and the Capital Markets Report, and the IMF has kindly provided dead tree copies of the Fiscal Monitor for everyone to pick up. Carlo is going to go beyond a bit in more depth than he was able to do when presenting the Fiscal Monitor recently ahead of the spring meetings for our audience, and we're grateful to him for doing that. I also, though, want to note, as Carlo is very proud of, we won't be talking about this directly today, but that the fiscal department at the fund does an enormous amount of work in technical assistance and advising to economies all over the world. And that's the part that doesn't get as much publicity, but I think everyone in this room appreciates their technocratic expertise and contribution, especially in light of a realistic economic assessment. So I personally, and I think everyone here, is very excited to have Carlo come speak. This is the latest of our ongoing interactions with the fund, which we're very proud and pleased to do. And I'll ask Carlo to take the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, for these very nice words and for inviting me here. I'm going to talk about a topic that has been keeping us busy for a few years, and indeed, as the title of my presentation suggests, From Here to Eternity, is going to keep us busy for a few more years. My presentation today is based on the Fiscal Monitor, the publication that was introduced in 2010 to monitor fiscal developments around the world. And more specifically, I will address four questions. First, how bad is the fiscal position in advanced economies? I will argue that it is indeed pretty bad. Some may argue that in some countries, at least, it has never been so bad. Second, what are the risks arising from the poor state of the fiscal accounts? High for some countries. For other countries, there is definitely more time. They are not under pressure for immediate adjustment, but in the long run, the situation requires adjustment for all of them. Third question, what is the appropriate strategy to address these fiscal challenges? And here I will argue what we have been arguing since at least 2010. The right approach is to proceed with fiscal adjustment, but at a moderate pace, at least unless you are subject to strong market pressures. And fourth, is the current adjustment strategy working? I will argue that yes, it is working, but there are still major challenges ahead of us. One issue that I will not discuss, but I will be happy to answer questions on this, is the merit of alternative approaches, non-orthodox approaches to fiscal adjustment, like high inflation or debt restructure. I'm sure there will be questions about this. So let me start with the first question: how bad is the fiscal position of advanced economies? And some of you may have already seen this picture, which shows the public debt to GDP ratio in the last 130 years. And we are at present at, for the average of advanced economies, at about 110% of GDP, which, as you can see, is the highest level ever achieved, except during the for a brief period during the Second World War. Public debt is also high in relation to financial sector net worth, although here the time series that we have available is much shorter. Now, I showed you the numbers about the Second World War, and in many respects, the situation is actually worse than at the end of the Second World War for various reasons. First, at the time, most of the fiscal adjustment was consisted of cuts in military spending, which are easier to implement from a political perspective. Second, spending from pension and health care will be on the rise over the next coming decades, which means that these are the numbers, by several percentage points of GDP in advanced economies, which means the countries in need of fiscal adjustment will have, so to speak, swim against the tide of rising spending. Third, growth prospects are not great. Growth is good to erode the debt to GDP ratio, but growth will be slower than in the 50s and the 60s when the population, the labor force was rising rapidly. We now project a decline in the labor force. And last but not least, in the 50s and 60s, financial markets were repressed, which by interest rate caps and investment requirements on government paper, which made it easier to finance public debt. Now, not all economies, not all advanced economies, however, are in trouble. And if we leave aside smaller countries, for example, Cyprus, there are essentially major fiscal challenges in 10 countries which have high debt and debt that is still rising. These countries are the US, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. Altogether, these countries amount to 40% of world GDP, so what happens to their fiscal policy is pretty important for the rest of the world. Now let's have a closer look at what the fiscal accounts in these countries have been doing in the last few years. In this chart, you will see on the horizontal axis the increase in the debt to GDP ratio since 2007. On the vertical axis, the level of the deficit since 2007. And I'm going to show you first the good guys, the other advanced economies, those where debt is either declining, stabilized, or is increasing by not much. These countries had a deterioration in the deficit in 2009, and the debt increases too. But already in 2010 and later on, you see nothing much happened since then. The deficit declines, the debt ratio increases on average a bit, not much of a development. The situation is very different for our 10 countries. You see here the averages first, a sharp shock in 2009, 2010, still some increase in the deficit, debt continues to increase. Since then, deficits are declining, but public debt is still increasing, and that's what happened, what is still happening. And if you look at individual countries, you see that these countries really belong to a different class with respect to the first group that we have seen. Very large increases is still in public debt in some of these countries. The magnitude of the fiscal challenges that these 10 countries are facing can also be, as said, illustrated by what is now become a sort of our famous long-term adjustments scenario, which focuses on the degree of fiscal tightening needed to lower public debt from the current level to, say, 60-80% by 2030. Now, let me give you more specifically an example of what exactly we do. We compute the improvement in the primary balance, that is the balance of the government net of interest payments, that needs to be achieved by 2020. We have a gradual adjustment up to 2020, and then the primary surplus is maintained at the same level for another 10 years. The goal is to stop the increase in the debt ratio and to achieve a certain target, which in this example is 60% of GDP, by 2030. I'm going to show you the results of these scenarios country by country, but before we do, I wanted to underscore that in this kind of scenarios, the degree of, there are two elements, two indicators of difficulty. The first one is the further tightening that is needed beyond 2013 by 2020 in our scenario, and the other one is the level at which the primary surplus needs to be maintained for a longer period of time. So we're going to have in this chart exactly these two components: the improvement in the structural primary balance to be achieved by 2020, and on the vertical axis, the level of the primary balance. And here are the countries. There is more than one dot per country because we run different scenarios. But the important, and you have a legend here to explain if you are interested exactly what is what. The important thing here is not so much the level of this thing, but the relative position of these countries. And in terms of relative position, we see that Belgium and France are in a relatively easier position with smaller fiscal adjustment beyond 2013, and a level of primary surplus that is lower than for other countries. Most of the other countries are in this central pack, with two exceptions. One is Italy, which is in an awkward position. The solar system for Italy is centered around the vertical axis, meaning that not much additional adjustment is needed in Italy. A lot was already accomplished in 2012 and 2013. But the level of the primary surplus that will have to be run to bring down public debt is higher than for other countries because of its higher current level of debt, which is about 130% of GDP. The other big exception is Japan. Japan is really the outlier. You see that clearly. It's outside our chart. So there are pretty big differences across countries, but in a way the challenges are big for all of them. So the next question is, what are the risks if no adjustment takes place? So the adjustment needs to be undertaken is large. The temptation could be, let's not do anything. What are the risks arising from the poor state of the fiscal accounts? And there are essentially two reasons to be concerned about public debt. The first one is the one that is linked to the name of, or very often has been linked to the names of Carmen Reiner and Ken Rogoff. High public debt causes long-term growth. Now, you know about the recently found mistake in the spreadsheet used by Reiner and Rogoff. But leaving aside this, leaving aside their study, there are a number of econometric studies that do find a relationship, not necessarily a threshold, but a relationship between high growth high debt and low growth, with the exception of the Panizza and Presbiterio paper at the bottom. The others find a causal relationship that goes from high debt to low growth. Now, without getting into the specific details, I think it's useful to look at this chart in which you do find a negative correlation between high debt and growth. And the important thing in this chart that growth is growth in the 5 years subsequent, the following year after each observation of the debt to GDP ratio, which at least suggests some causality running from high debt to low growth. The second reason why we should be worried about public debt relates to the risk of fiscal crisis. You know the theory here: a country that has high debt is particularly subject to a loss of weak market sentiment, self-fulfilling expectations. If your debt is high, even a relatively small increase in interest rate moves you from a sustainable to an unsustainable position. In practice, we do see that there is a correlation between the perception of risk as depicted, for example, as described, for example, by CDS spreads and fiscal fundamentals. In this chart, you find gross for each country, gross debt, the headline deficit, and each country is represented by a balloon whose size is proportional to the CDS spread. And you find that almost all large balloons correspond to a combination of high deficit and high debt. Not all large balloons. You find also some small balloons, which means that having bad fiscal accounts is not a necessary condition to be in trouble, but it is not a sufficient condition to be in trouble, but it is a necessary condition to be in trouble. There are some countries which are lucky for a number of reasons. They have high deficits, high debt, but they still pay low interest rates. Why? Several reasons. I just here want to point at one that I think is important, namely the fact that over the last few years, central banks have flooded financial markets with liquidity to support economic activity, but this clearly facilitates the financing of public debt, particularly of countries like Japan, the US, and the UK, where the base money to GDP ratio increased by several percentage points, like, for example, 20 percentage points plus in the United Kingdom. The problem is that at one point this monetization of public debt will have to be reversed. It has not been inflationary so far because markets have demanded a lot of liquidity, but at one point the reverse will have to happen and money will have to be mopped up. There will have to be an increase in the amount of treasury bills, government paper sold by the central bank to the market, and this will drive up interest rates. Altogether, I think that maintaining public debt at high levels over the longer run does not seem to be a great idea. And there is probably consensus about this, although there are different views about how dangerous the situation is for various countries, how rapid the fiscal adjustment should be, and how exactly why high public debt is bad for economic activity. But as I said, there is a lot of consensus about the fact that there is in general a need to bring down public debt. It's a strategy to bring it down that is being discussed. So let me move to the next question, which is indeed, what is the appropriate strategy to address these fiscal challenges? Which is the famous austerity debate. And in this austerity debate, how fast you need to move to bring down public debt, there are essentially two positions plus our position. There is the Dove view that says fiscal Dove view. There is no immediate fiscal problem, and there is actually room to expand. We have the fiscal hawkish view that says there would be a high price to be paid for committing the sin of fiscal profligacy. And then there is our position, which has been an intermediate one between these two, since we published with Olivier this blog post, The 10 Commandments of Fiscal Adjustment in Advanced Economies. Now, I'm not going to go through the 10 Commandments. I'm just summarizing 4 main points of our intermediate position. The first one is that for countries that are not subject to market pressure, fiscal adjustment should proceed at a moderate pace within a medium-term fiscal adjustment plan to enhance credibility. Second point, this medium-term plan should be defined in cyclically adjusted terms so as to allow automatic stabilizers to operate, so you can respond through automatic stabilizers to shocks from economic activity, on economic activity. Countries under market pressure should proceed more rapidly, but also for this, there is a speed limit beyond which too much fiscal tightening is damaging. And finally, this fiscal strategy, and this is very important, it's not my presentation will not be much on this, but this is very important. Fiscal strategy should be supported by continued relaxed monetary conditions to support economic activity and facilitate the financing of public debt, and structural reforms to boost long-term growth, because that is extremely important for the long-term behavior of the fiscal account. So let's look more closely at, let me skip this one for brevity, but let's look more closely to, on the one hand, the cost of fiscal tightening and the cost of fiscal profligacy. As I mentioned, our position is intermediate because it acknowledges that there are costs on both sides and that there are no linearities. So you want to be in the middle because extreme positions are more costly. So what are the costs of fiscal adjustment? In a recent blog by Olivier Blanchard and Daniel Lay, The two authors underscore that the cost of fiscal tightening are now particularly high for a number of reasons. First of all, fiscal multipliers are particularly high now because of the downward flexibility in interest rates. You cannot get a break from lower interest rates. The difficulty banks have in extending credit, particularly in Europe, the related large share of households that are credit rationed, and the fact that in a recession, when you tighten demand, you affect output more directly rather than prices. Sometimes you hear that by designing the fiscal adjustment properly, by choosing the proper measure, you can get away with a recessionary effect. There is a famous paper by Giavazzi and Pagano published in 1990 describing a model and providing some empirical evidence for expansionary fiscal contraction. So you tighten fiscal policy and the economy grows through expectation mechanism, through confidence mechanism. I don't think these mechanisms, particularly if you cut spending rather than revenues, I think government needs to design the fiscal adjustment in the best possible way to minimize the multipliers both in the short term and in the long run. But I believe that it would be too optimistic now to hope in a free lunch that you tighten fiscal policy and there is no negative impact on the economy, because those mechanisms that were supposed to support economic activity when you tighten fiscal policy, declining interest rates, and for some countries, depreciating exchange rates, are not operating for most of the countries that would be now in need for fiscal adjustment. Second reason why fiscal tightening is particularly high now, and here for brevity I will summarize a bit. The cost of an output loss is larger when the economy is already growing slowly. Nobody likes nonlinearities. There is also some evidence that markets do not dislike nonlinearities. So they dislike a particularly large decline in economic activity. To the point that the excessive fiscal tightening could lead not to a decline in interest rates, but to an increase in interest rates. I'll skip the detail of this chart because it would take me too long, but essentially the idea is that if you tighten fiscal policy too much, markets become worried about two things. One is the decline in economic activity, even if it is a short-term decline. And second, the increase in the debt to GDP ratio that you may have when you tighten fiscal policy, because the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio declines. GDP declines, and so in the short run, it's quite easy to get an increase in the debt to GDP ratio when you tighten fiscal policy. And the last point that explains why fiscal tightening can be very costly, particularly now, is the one that has been raised by Larry Summers and Brad DeLong. Hysteresis effects are particularly strong now because the recession has been a long one. The number of long-term unemployed is high, and so we now have to be worried about the fact that the cost of a recession are going to be short-term, but they're going to be more longer-term than usual. Now let's look, however, at the other side too, the costs arising from fiscal profligacy. I already mentioned that these relate to the impact of high debt on long-term growth and the risk of a fiscal crisis. Let me therefore just make 3 points regarding the cost of fiscal profligacy. The first one is that if there were a perfect commitment technology, there would be no problem. If I could say, okay, I postpone the adjustment today, or I even expand today, but you can be sure that I will tighten tomorrow when times are good, there will be no problem. The problem is that, however, we are missing a perfect commitment to technology that allows markets to believe that when times are good, fiscal policy will be tightened. And things are unfortunately made worse by 3 things. First, in the past, advanced economy did not use their good times to lower public debt. And that's why we got to the crisis in 2007 when public debt was already at a very high level from an historical perspective. The second point is that this sort of what I call the fiscal dancing, the fiscal twist, expand today, tighten tomorrow, was already danced once in 2008, 2001 when countries expanded and said, look, I'm going to tighten tomorrow. Now, for this country, the tomorrow is now, and they were supposed to tighten now. And the third point is that, unfortunately, often we argue, and I think it's a good point to make from a policy perspective, you should reform entitlement spending because that cuts spending in the long run, but there's limited impact on economic activity today. So these kind of reforms are very important. There is, however, limited or no empirical evidence that markets respond well to these reforms. This is a relationship between projected country by country projected increases in entitlement spending over the next 20 years and CDS spreads, and actually the relationship is slightly negative. We need to understand better this. We have not done enough work. But unfortunately, I don't know of any econometric relationship regression explaining government paper interest rates, which has on the right-hand side these entitlement variables. So more work at least is needed in this area. Second point, second issue I want to mention about the cost of fiscal profligacy. We tend to underestimate this cost, the cost of fiscal crisis before they actually occur. And this perhaps is due to the following reason. First of all, these costs are the likelihood, this is an event that is hard to predict. A fiscal crisis is hard to predict. We don't know when it will happen. We are in a situation of Knightian uncertainty about the occurrence of a fiscal crisis. We know that these things happen all of a sudden and without much warning. We also see that the costs can only be observed after the crisis has taken place, and the costs can be very high in terms of growth, but we don't observe it immediately. Why? We observe the more slow-moving cost of fiscal austerity. So there may be a tendency to underestimate the cost of fiscal crisis before they actually occur. And the third point relates to the fact that the risk of turmoil on the government paper market is different across countries. It affects more some countries rather than others, but nobody is completely exempt from this kind of risk. If we take the two largest advanced economies, the US and Japan, obviously the risk of turmoil in the government paper market at present is quite low. Quite low does not mean probability zero, and that's why I think that over the medium term there is a need to worry about possible risks in the government paper market, even for these countries. Again, it's a black swan event. Black swan events do occur. I don't think there is any risk of anything bad happening in the immediate future, but it's something that is one of those tail events that needs to be taken into account in designing fiscal policy. The bottom line is that faced with the costs of high on both sides, costs which are probably non-linear on both sides, it makes sense in our view to have an intermediate position to adjust fiscal policy at a moderate pace and with a medium-term perspective. Of course, if you are subject to monetary pressure and therefore the risk of a fiscal crisis is already high, you would have to tighten fiscal policy faster. Given this approach, which are the countries that follow our prescription and which are the countries that do not follow our prescriptions? Some examples. On the one hand, you have Japan, which in our view is moving too slowly in terms of fiscal adjustment. It has not yet adopted a fully fledged fiscal adjustment plan. The deficit remains at about 9% and its public debt continues rising. Japan has become a sort of an outlier. This is in this three-dimensional chart. You have the deficit, the primary deficit, and net public debt, and you see Japan is now in a sort of corner compared to other countries, and it was not like this 3 years ago when Japan was in the group of other countries. Japan is becoming a bit of an outlier from this point of view. It needs to introduce a medium-term plan quickly, and the measure will have to go beyond what is currently envisaged, such as the increase in the VAT rate from 5 to 10%. On the other hand, you have the United States, which is adjusting too fast this year. The fiscal cliff has been avoided, but even without the fiscal cliff, the cut in the deficit, in the underlying deficit, will be the largest one of the last, at least of the last 30 years. We think this is too much. There is no need for the US to move so quickly. It's affecting growth unnecessarily. I think we have argued that the US should introduce a medium-term fiscal adjustment plan, and in this context, a more gradual fiscal adjustment would be preferable. How about Europe? Europe is not growing much, as you know. We have argued that at least some countries where growth, there has been a chronic lack of demand, should at least consider slowing down the pace of adjustment. But for most of the countries, Europe, we think that 2013 is okay in terms of underlying measure. There is another danger, however, which is just to target nominal deficit to GDP ratio rather than underlying structural deficit to GDP ratio. And therefore, if there is a deceleration of economic activity, there will be the need of introducing additional measures to achieve the old target, which I think would be very wrong. These kind of pro-cyclical policies need to be avoided. The good news here is that the European institutions have shown quite a lot of flexibility in this area. The targets of the SGP and of the excessive deficit procedure are still nominal targets. That 3% remains a nominal target, but the European institutions have shown quite a lot of, shown quite a lot of flexibility in revising the targets for European countries, which I think is a very sensible thing to do. Let me now move to my last question. Is this strategy of steady fiscal adjustment working, and is it realistic to continue it in the future? Yes, it is working. We have some concrete results. 2 milestones will be reached this year for advanced economy. The first one is that the deficit, the average deficit, will be halved with respect to 2009, from about 9% of GDP to about little more than 4.5% of GDP. Second milestone, after years of continued increase, the debt to GDP ratio will actually, on average, weighted average with GDP weights, will actually stabilize, will decline slightly, which again is good news. So fiscal tightening is unfortunately costly for economic activity. It is at least yielding some results in terms of improvements of the fiscal accounts. There is, however, a lot that remains to be done. And let's go back to the chart that, this is a bit complicated, it's my last chart, I promise you, but it requires a bit more of thinking. I showed you this chart before. This is the improvement that is needed for countries to achieve a certain targets in terms of debt to GDP ratio between 60 and 80%, with different interest rates and growth assumption. How difficult is it to achieve those targets? To answer this question, what we have done is something sensible, I think, is to look at the past 60 years, and we look at the best fiscal performance of these countries, of these economies, when they really tried hard. So we looked at, first of all, what is the maximum primary surplus that each country ran over the past 60 years for a 10-year period. And this is the distribution of those maximum primary surpluses, which has a median of about 3.25% of GDP. Then we have also looked at the maximum improvement achieved over the last 60 years during a 7-year period. Why 7 years? Because between now and 2020, which is the horizon considered in our adjustment scenario, there are still 7 years. But we have to take into account that these countries have already been adjusted for 3 years. So you have been running for 3 years, and you are asked to run for another 7 years. So we have looked at the distribution of improvement in the primary balance in 7 years after 3 years of adjustment that had already taken place. And we get this distribution with a median of about 5%. Then we use the percentiles or the quartiles of this distribution to identify in our chart areas of increasing difficulty with colors closer to red indicating increasing difficulty. This vertical line is the median of the improvement in structural primary balances achieved over a 7-year period. And the good news is that we see that most of the countries now, most of the scenarios now are on the left of the median. It's not easy because remember, these are the median of the distribution of the best performance that each country had in the past, but it's still relatively good news. However, when we do the same for the level, we see that the median, most of the countries are above the median primary surplus, median maximum primary surplus achieved in the past, which tells you that the bottom line is this, is that while achieving certain primary surplus targets will be relatively easy, maintaining large surpluses for a long time will be more difficult. Which brings me to the end of my presentation, but I would like to end with something relatively positive, optimistic. Will it be necessary, indeed, will it be indeed necessary to maintain primary surpluses for such a long time? And here I think that one can be relatively optimistic. I think the markets are worried, they want to see the debt to GDP ratio declining. Whether certain targets of the debt to GDP ratio is achieved in 2025, 2030, as in our scenario, or 2040, is probably less important. If so, then we could expect that interest rate will decline faster than in our scenario, which are relatively conservative, in which case it would be possible to bring down surpluses, primary surpluses, and yet to remain on a downward trajectory of the debt to GDP ratio. Again, not easy, but I think that one can hope that this is the scenario that will materialize. So to conclude, getting debt ratios back to where they were before the crisis, or where they need to be, is not going to be easy. It's going to be a long process, but hopefully it will not last from here to eternity. With this, I would like to thank you, and please go to our website to see, to have further details about the world's fiscal accounts. Thank you very much.